Even. Break even is the point where businesses aren't making a profit or a loss. They're just covering the costs. And total revenue equals total costs. Before we go on to calculating break even and doing the charts, let's go through why break even is useful for businesses. Break even allows firms to work out how many sales they need to cover their costs. After this point, they'll start to make a profit. It can also show a firm how the break-even point changes if prices or costs change, so it gives the business a range of alternatives to look at. This information may also be useful to show a bank if a business is trying to get a loan. The bank will want to know just how realistic the break-even point is. Let's have a look at calculating the break-even point. You'll need to know the fixed costs, the variable costs, and the selling price per unit. The selling price minus the variable costs is known as the contribution. So if we look at the calculation, it'll look like this. So, break-even output equals the fixed costs divided by the contribution per unit. The contribution was worked out by taking away the variable costs from the selling price. Remember that the contribution per unit goes towards covering the fixed costs. When these have been covered, the firm will start to make a profit. Why don't you pause and have a go? I'll give you the data and you can work out the break-even point. In other words, the break-even output. Okay, let's go over to Chris and find out about his surfboard business.
Hi, I'm Chris, and I'm going to set up a business selling surfing gear. I was thinking, if I sold each surfboard for, say, £200 each, and each board cost me, say, £80 to make, and my fixed costs are £120,000, what would my break-even output be?
How'd it go? Your answer should be 1,000 surfboards, and the way you worked it out should look like this. The break-even point equals the fixed costs divided by the contribution per unit. So, if you put the figures in, you get this. The break-even point equals 120,000. which are his fixed costs, divided by 120, which is the contribution. This was worked out by taking the variable costs, in this case his materials, away from the selling price, which is £200. 120,000 divided by 120 equals 1,000, which is the number of surfboards Chris needs to sell to break even. Let's have a look at the break-even point when the selling price changes. Back over to Chris again. So
my fixed costs are 120,000 and my variable costs are £80 a surfboard. But this time I've decided to increase the selling price of each board to £220. Now, can you work out what the break-even point would be? This would really help me, so make sure you show all of your workings out.
Done it? Your calculations should look like this. The break-even point equals fixed costs divided by the contribution per unit. So if we put the figures into the calculation, it'll look like this. The break-even point equals 120,000 divided by 140, which is the £220 selling price minus the £80 variable costs. The break-even point is therefore 857. So, by increasing his prices, he brings the break-even point down and could make profit earlier because he wouldn't have to sell as many surfboards to cover all his costs. But it's important to try and be analytical wherever possible. Simply putting the price up won't necessarily lead to earlier profit, because a higher price might put people off buying his surfboards. This is where knowing the price elasticity of demand comes in useful. You also need to remember that the results are only as accurate as the data used, and estimating figures can be quite difficult. Before we look at break-even charts, let's just look at another calculation you might be asked to do. You could be asked to work out the profit or loss at different outputs. To do this, you need to work out total contribution, which is the contribution per unit times the number of units, and take away the fixed costs. So, if the selling price is £60 and variable costs are £40 per unit and fixed costs are £100,000, we can work out the different profits or losses at different outputs. First, let's work out the contribution per unit. The formula is selling price minus variable costs per unit. This would give us £60 minus £40, which equals £20. Right, let's work out what the profit or loss would be at 1,500 units. The calculation is total contribution minus fixed costs. So this would be contribution per unit times the output minus the fixed costs, which is £20, times 1,500 minus £100,000. This gives us £30,000 minus £100,000, which is minus £70,000, and therefore a loss. Now you have a go. This time, work out the profit or loss at 8,000 units. How'd it go? Your calculation should look like this. So that would be £20 times 8,000 minus £100,000, which is £160,000, minus £100,000, which gives £60,000 profit. Is that okay? If you're confused, go back and look at this bit again.